My title is Fisheries Biologist with the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources, and I focus my work almost all on Bear Lake. I've worked at Bear Lake for most of my career, and most of my work focuses on Bear Lake. I've been a resident of Garden City since 1992. They've done some coring in the bottom of Bear Lake. We know that Bear Lake is at least 250,000 years old, and there's some evidence to suggest that it might be as old as 1 million or more years old. So a lot of the literature that people cite or recognize, some of that is not correct unless they're looking at the most recent literature, which states it's at least 250,000 years old, or could get even older than that by examining some of the cores in the bottom of the lake. First of all, there's not a lot of species diversity in Utah. When we're talking a rich number of species out there, we're talking maybe 7 to 8 or 9 species at the most. But Bear Lake has 4 endemic species which are found nowhere else in the world, and that makes it really a unique body of water. 3 out of the 4 endemic species are sport fish, which is really interesting because you can go out and catch those fish and harvest those fish. We have regulations on those fish. The other fish is not a sport fish. Most people probably have never seen it in the lake, but it's there. It's a Bear Lake sculpin. Well, I did some checking around. We do have another endemic species in Utah. It's the June sucker, and it's only found in Utah Lake. It's an endangered species. Now, usually when you have a fish that's endemic, it's usually threatened or endangered because it got a very limited distribution or a very small population. That's not the case with any of the 4 fish on Bear Lake. The fish are only found in Bear Lake, but the populations are quite robust. Those species also serve as a food base for some of the higher predators in the lake. These are quite unique that we got 4 fish that are found in Bear Lake and nowhere else in the world. Not a lot of waters can say that. Even in the Great Lakes states, we don't see that kind of really special species where there's a lot of different whitefish and cisco in those lakes, but they're found in a lot of other lakes too. The endemic species have evolved with each other in Bear Lake. There was some evidence that some of the endemic species in Bear Lake right now were also found in ancient Lake Bonneville when Bonneville was here. Yeah, so there's no other species that are similar to the species found in Bear Lake. They are only in Bear Lake right now, and as far as we know, they're nowhere else. Now, the Division of Wildlife Resources has tried unsuccessfully, along with other state agencies, to move cisco into some other bodies of water throughout the United States, and those fish have just never survived. For example, we've moved them to Flaming Gorge Reservoir that's in Utah and Wyoming, and they've never shown up there. I heard the rumor about the tunnels that connect Bear Lake and Loch Ness, and I can pretty much assure you that them are just rumors, and it's not a truth. There are some interesting features on Bear Lake that make it unique, but the tunnels between the two, where maybe the Loch Ness monster swims between Bear Lake and Loch Ness in Scotland, are not true. No. The species that are endemic to Bear Lake, the 4 endemic species, are not found in any other body of water, including Loch Ness. There's always some internet posts that show some big creature supposedly on the shores of Bear Lake, and they speak about the Division of Wildlife and biologists, but those people that are recognized in those articles no one has ever worked for the state of Utah, as far as I know, and most of those pictures are taken from along a coastal area, somewhere along Scotland or England, of probably some mammal that washed up along the shore. It looks a lot like Bear Lake. It's a big body of water for sure, but those are just rumors. I don't think on the scale of a Bear Lake monster size that you were talking about, that it could really exist in Bear Lake, just because we've done enough work on the lake, we would have seen it by now. But there are other species that are out there in Bear Lake that I don't think have been described yet. For example, I'm pretty sure we have some type of freshwater jellyfish in Bear Lake that's never been described in the literature, as well as several species of ostracods that are probably endemic ostracods and only found in Bear Lake, and that might be some of the reason where some of these endemic fish species have evolved with endemic food species. So ostracods are a small insect. It's a bug that lives right on the bottom. It's really not classified as a zooplankton, it's just an invertebrate. It's called a seed shrimp, which is its common name, and they filter water very similar to a zooplankton, but they're associated with the marl sediment right where the water meets the marl on the bottom, and they actually serve as a very important food source for Bear Lake whitefish. Yeah, so there's one species of freshwater jellyfish that's quite common throughout the United States. People always ask, are these freshwater jellyfish a danger to humans? And the answer is they've never been shown to be a danger to humans. They do sting. Their zooplankton is what they eat. They sting the zooplankton and they can do that, but they've never been shown to penetrate skin on any of the bodies of water where they've been. So there's no concern for people that are swimming in Bear Lake that might encounter one. But occasionally over the last 27 years I've seen remnants of these show up in cutthroat trout or lake trout stomachs. I would guess maybe about 6 inches would be a big one most of the time, and I get some reports of people describing exactly what I would consider that, maybe about 2 to 3 inches in diameter. There are some underwater caves along the east side. Some of the people that scuba dive over there have talked about them. However, no one's ever, I don't think the caves are really large enough for people to get into or swim into, or maybe they said maybe that's where the Bear Lake monster lives, in these caves. And as far as we know, the caves aren't large enough for any large creature to live in. It would be equal to looking up at the side of a mountain that has a very steep side, and you can see some caves that are carved out by wind or water over the years. And these big caves that are up on the side of the mountain are pretty much the same type of caves you'll see underneath the water along the east side of Bear Lake. Yeah, I can describe what lake turnover is. So water is unique in that it's most dense when it hits about 39 degrees Fahrenheit. So in the spring, when there's ice, or maybe not ice cover on the lake, but the top of the water is about 32 degrees because that's where the ice is going to form. When the lake starts to warm up a little bit and it hits about 39 degrees, that really dense water at 39 degrees starts to sink, and that water sinks down into the water column and it pushes water up on the bottom that's at 39 degrees. So the lake, what means it turns over is the water just kind of rotates within the lake itself because it's all about the same density. Then in the summertime, when it warms up, of course the dense water stays right on the bottom. It stays at 39 degrees, it stays on the bottom, and then the water kind of stratifies. And so you have warm water on the top, cold water on the bottom, and the interface between those two layers is what we call the thermocline. And so it's an area where the water changes very rapidly from a warm water to cold water as you're going down through the water column. Then in the fall, the turnover happens again. So as the lake water on the surface cools down to about 39 degrees, then that water starts to sink, and as it starts to sink, it displaces all the water down below it. Some of it's warmer, some of it's colder right at the bottom, and then at that time of the year, pretty much the temperature of the lake, no matter if you take it at the surface or in the middle or at the bottom, it's always about the same temperature. And then in the winter, it starts to stratify again, where you have the 32 degree water that's trying to freeze right up on the surface, and then that real dense 39 degree water is right on the bottom of the lake. So we have, it's called dimictic, which means mixing twice, which means it mixes in the spring and in the fall. So when the lake does mix, we do see fish that can be found typically only on the bottom of the lake. They could be found throughout the water column just for a couple weeks out of the year. And so during that mixing time, it's a really kind of a unique time of the year. It suspends a lot of food. One of the things that people see is when the lake turns over is some of the calcium carbonate, or marl, which is the common name, which is right on the bottom of the lake, some of that gets suspended into the water column, and so then you get some really unique things happening. So if you have a bright sunny day, the lake looks extremely blue. If you have a cloudy day, it kind of looks like this grayish haze, and what you're seeing is the sun or the light being reflected off these calcium carbonate particles that are in the water column, and it changes based on what the sun is doing or maybe the clouds or whatever. So the lake almost looks like it has moods. You see the lake one day it's really dark blue, the next day it's like a really Caribbean blue, azure blue, and then other days it's very gray. And so anyways, and that really is pronounced during the turnover seasons, both in the spring and in the fall. It's the color of the lake is really dependent on the atmosphere and how much light is coming into the lake. But the calcium carbonate has a unique property that it reflects that blue light or whatever, and so if you have a really blue sky and then that makes the lake even that much more blue. And other times when you see the gray sky, it makes it more of a azure blue or a greenish gray. For example, one time I was on the east side of the lake. It was in the middle of January. It was about 20 below zero, and I was checking fishermen, and I looked out in the lake. The lake was like glass, calm, and yet out in the middle of the lake I could see something very pronounced. It was moving rhythmically back and forth, and it was right along the water surface, and it was quite long, and I couldn't see what it was, but I mean I could definitely see it was something out of the ordinary. I went up and got a spotting scope, and a 60 power spotting scope, and zoomed in, and lo and behold, it was a herd of elk that were swimming across the lake in January. And so people said, well, how does that happen, or why does it happen? And there's a couple reasons. One, there's no explanation. Other ones, they might have been being chased by a predator, mountain lion, a group of coyotes, or they just sensed there was food on the other side of the lake. And so if you get a big herd of elk, and you can imagine all of their heads sticking out of the water and following each other, it would look like a series of humps in the water, and especially when they were pulsating back and forth. When I saw the herd of elk, I watched them for a while. They swam all the way across from the west side of the lake to the east side of the lake. They got out, they fed in a field over there all day, and then in the evening they got back in the water, swam across the lake again, and they came out within just a few hundred yards of where they started. It was quite remarkable, and I wouldn't have believed it unless I saw it with my own eyes. And so other things I've seen out in the lake that are really unique is some parts of the lake is so big that you could have weather phenomenon in one part of the lake and maybe not in another part of the lake. And so you might be on a side of the lake that's, say, for very sunny and calm, and you look out there and you see some disturbance along the surface, and you're going, gosh, so there's no waves, no nothing. But the other side of the lake might be blowing, and there might be 2 or 3 foot waves there. And so some of these waves come across the lake, and again, you see these big disturbances of waves on a very calm, sunny day where you might be on one side of the lake and it might be different on the other. Yeah, so I've seen herds of elk, I've seen herds of deer, I've seen coyotes out on floating pieces of ice when the lake was trying to freeze over, and a coyote might have walked out there to maybe get a piece of fish or something off the ice, and then that chunk of ice broke off before the coyote. Instead of the coyote wanting to swim, he stayed on the chunk of ice, and so there might be open water years and a big sheet of ice floating around. You could look out there and see some animal on the ice. It makes you do a double take, but I've been around the lake and been out there so many times that I've seen a dead cow out in the lake floating in the middle. I've seen mountain lions. I've picked up coyotes, and dead deer and dead elk. And so anyway, so a lot of critters. People, when the critters get chased out onto the shoreline, or for some reason they go out onto the shoreline, another good explanation, especially along shoreline areas, are moose. If you have adult moose that will walk out into the water, waist deep or chest deep, and get out there where they're almost submerged sometimes, where just their head is sticking out. People see this big moose head with a big set of antlers, and it makes it look pretty weird sometimes, and because they're not expecting to see a moose out in the lake, so all of a sudden their mind starts working a little bit overtime, and then the moose sometimes will put its head right under water, and they can hold their breath quite long, and they can feed off the weeds on the bottom of the lake, and then they'll put their head back up, and so they can, it appears and then it disappears and it reappears, and so it makes people wonder what's going on. So One of the other questions you had asked me earlier was, is there any phenomenon that can explain what might be considered a Bear Lake monster out there? And I mentioned a herd of elk or a herd of deer or coyotes on the ice or things like that. One of the other things that people don't realize is a lot of times when there's a lot of boat traffic in the summertime, the lake can be very calm, and you get some of these boats that are making circles, especially now these big wakeboard boats that make these huge waves. And those waves travel a long way, and a lot of times you don't notice the waves because they're very regular and very just kind of like swells. But when the waves approach the shoreline, they start to break. And so, you're on shore sometimes and you're looking out there, and you might be way up off the shore, maybe up in a cabin on the side of the hill, and you look at the lake, and that boat might have been out there playing around 15-20 minutes ago, and then the boat's long gone. But those waves slowly move into shore, and when it comes into shore, then the waves start to break, and people are up on the cabin looking, going, there's no boats out there. Why are these waves breaking? Are those waves breaking, or is it some kind of critter along the shoreline making these waves, or something in the water making those waves? And so yeah, that's another way to describe a way to. I guess it's another way to describe a phenomenon out there that might be misinterpreted as a Bear Lake monster. Sonar units, or fish finders that people like to call them, have come a long way, and the ones that are out there now are quite powerful and quite amazing, and so anglers, the average angler, can afford them now, and they're out there with them, and they take pictures of their screenshots of what they're seeing, and they come in and say, what is this? Because they're in maybe 100 feet of water, and they have this big blob in the middle of the screen. It's not on the bottom, it's not on the top, it might be in the middle of the water column, and it looks like there's a big critter down there, and I agree, it's unique looking, and it's very common to see this. But what it is typically it's one of the endemic species, the Bonneville cisco. They're a schooling fish, and they're what they call pelagic, which means they're found out in the middle of the lake. The other species are all bottom oriented. There's two whitefish, the Bonneville whitefish and the Bear Lake whitefish, that are found right along the bottom, and the sculpin, Bear Lake sculpin, is found right along the bottom. But the cisco swim around in the water column suspended. They school up, especially when there's bright sun, because it's their way to avoid getting eaten by predators. Sometimes the schools can be so dense that it actually looks like a one object rather than thousands and thousands of cisco in one school. And so when you're looking at your electronics and all of a sudden you see a big blob on it, it looks like it might be one big critter down there, when really it could be a school of tightly packed cisco in the water column.
Interesting.
Yep, and I've seen that too, where I've looked over the side of the boat. I've seen it 2 times in all the years I've been at Bear Lake, where I've been out fishing on the lake, and I was looking at my sonar, and I see a big blob on the sonar. And so the natural instinct is you want to look over the side. Bear Lake has very clear water, so you look over the side of the boat, and one of them was in February. The cisco were just kind of finishing spawning, so they were probably getting back into the schools and starting to feed again. And we looked down, and you could literally see thousands of cisco below the boat in a very tightly packed school. And the sonar units recognize that as one entity or one object rather than a whole bunch of objects. And so, anyway, so I've wondered about that too, but it was pretty easy to explain once we started setting nets, and when I saw it with my own eyes what exactly was below my boat on a sunny day. I've had other anglers ask me the same question, or tell me that they've seen a big school of cisco right below the boat, or the cisco might be jumping right along the surface of the water, and they might be just feeding or coming up after plankton that's suspended in the water column.
The whole school comes up?
Yeah, I've seen literally, I've been out one time where I saw a bunch of little ripples on the surface next to the boat, and it was cisco that were right along the surface, and I'm sure that they probably followed the food up off the bottom, or they were chased by a predator up off the bottom, and they rose up to try to get away from the predator, and then they just hit the surface of the water. So anyway, so there's a couple of reasons for that. So
interesting. How big are the Cisco?
Cisco grow to a maximum size of about 8 inches, and so they're not a very large fish. They look a lot like a rainbow smelt that are found in the Great Lakes, but very different species. Cisco feeds solely on zooplankton, and they filter feed where a smelt that is typically found in the Great Lakes, they're predaceous, they have teeth, and they'll eat other fish. And so anyway, Cisco are unique fish, and they serve as a forage base for cutthroat trout and lake trout in the lake.
Cool.
So yes, I'm intrigued by it, but I also have worked on the lake enough to realize that what people are thinking that might be the Bear Lake monster could maybe be explained by natural phenomenon like weather or animals in the lake. It's been featured in papers and back into the history, back into the 1800s even. Even prior to that, there's been accounts of some of the settlers talking about some of the stories that the Indians talked to them about. And I just heard of some of the Indians that they would, and this is passed down from, from the Indians to the settlers and to now. And so anyways, but the Indians were very cautious of letting their children swim in the lake because they didn't want the so-called Bear Lake monster to come up and take the children from along the shoreline areas. And so that's one of the big rumors or maybe big stories that I've heard. Also, in the late 1800s, there were some of the settlers that talked about, Bear Lake monster, and every so often you'll hear people, saying that they saw something that really they're not sure exactly what they saw. There's some pictures out there that show, some pretty cool photos, but with further examination, and without having any evidence in hand to determine if there's any kind of Bear Lake monster, it's hard to argue with anybody.
Yeah.
Bear Lake's a large lake. It's about 20 miles long. It's anywhere from about 5 to 8 miles wide. Its widest spot is pretty much right on the state line between the states of Utah and Idaho. It's very regularly shaped. So it's shaped like kind of like a bathtub. There's not a lot of bays or inlets anywhere around the lake to take cover, and so Bear Lake is subject to some pretty extreme weather conditions, especially if the wind comes up either in the summer or winter time. I've seen where the lake has been ice covered with 5 or 6 inches of ice, and we had a huge windstorm, and within an hour the entire lake is devoid of ice. And so you really have to be careful when you're recreating on Bear Lake. It doesn't matter if you're out in a boat or along the shoreline or maybe on the ice in the winter. Okay, so Bear Lake, its maximum depth is 208 feet. That's when the lake is at full pool. And so typically the lake is not up to full pool, and it's been quite a few years since it's been right up to full pool. So just over 200 feet. The unique thing about Bear Lake is the average depth of Bear Lake is about 85 feet. And that to me is more important as a biologist, because if you took a map of Bear Lake and you didn't know where the deeper depths or shallower depths were, and you just threw a dart at the map, and wherever that dart landed, the average depth would be 85 feet. And so that gives Bear Lake an incredible amount of volume of water. In fact, the volume of water is so big that you could fit nearly 2 entire Flaming Gorge volumes into one Bear Lake volume. And so so that just shows you how large the lake is. Flaming Gorge is over 100 miles long, but it's quite a bit narrower in some areas. But Bear Lake is 20 miles long, and yet we can fit the volume of 2 Flaming Gorge reservoirs into the Bear Lake. Couple of reasons. In the 1970s, they did some soundings, both through using a boat and through the ice, with a line and checking the exact depth. Since that time, we've come a long way with electronics, and in the early 2000s, we actually mapped the entire bottom of the lake with the people from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, and again, we determined that exactly what was known is the maximum depth of Bear Lake is 208 feet. It is. It's on the USGS site. You can go to Woods Hole and Google Bear Lake and find the maps, and people can download those maps maps that show exactly where the deep spots are. Bear Lake is interesting. It's very deep along the east side and very shallow along the west side. And the reason why is the east side has the fault line. And so when there's any kind of earthquakes, the mountains on the east side of the lake get pushed up and the bottom of the lake tips down. And so you have this very steep shoreline. On the west side of the lake, it's called the hinge part, and so that just hinges up and down, kind of like a door. If you picture a door laying on its side, if it hinged down, you'd have a very steep side, and where the hinge is attached, it's very regular and shallow all the way across the lake. You know, I think the legend is out there. I think it's alive and well, and it definitely promotes the area. And it makes people think a little bit, because we do have some, even in this day and age, we have some unique species in Bear Lake, and there's other ones that may have never been described that are still found in Bear Lake. And so whether it's the freshwater jellyfish or these endemic ostracods that are little critters that live along the bottom of the lake, you know, there's still a lot of work to be done on Bear Lake. Oh, there's some, I've learned over the years, I listen to people, what they have to say, and they explain what they saw, and they ask me what I think, and then I explain what I think. But that's as far as I go. I don't try to argue with them, because it'd be like, you know, trying to argue if the sky is blue or not. You know, it's like, so I just, you know, you try to explain, but I'll let them draw their own conclusions, because they might have seen something that maybe I've never seen before. And so anyways, so I've learned to not argue with the people that are really insistent on what they've seen, because they know what they've seen. I didn't get to see it, so.